On the dusty plains of Eridani IV, beneath twin suns that scorched the sky, Elias Kane found solace in the rhythmic hum of his ancient tractor. The machine, rusted and stubborn, was as old as he was sturdy, dependable, and just a little rough around the edges. As he coaxed the contraption across the barren field, he muttered under his breath, "Damn things held together by spit and hope, just like me." His neighbors often wondered why Elias stayed, why he didn't flee like so many others when the Galactic Empire's shadow stretched over their quiet colony. But Elias had fought in wars, seen empires rise and fall, and knew that no tyranny lasted forever. Besides, he had planted roots here, and even the Empire couldn't uproot them without a fight. The morning peace shattered with the low rumble of Imperial gunships descending from the sky. Dust plumed in their wake, curling around Elias like specters. He squinted up, wiping sweat from his brow, and saw the Imperial insignia, sharp, cruel lines against cold metal. "Well, hell," he sighed, "and I thought today might be quiet." A troop transport thudded into the ground nearby, disgorging soldiers like locusts. They marched with precision, armor gleaming, faces hidden behind emotionless visors. At their head strode Commander Varkos, tall, angular, and radiating a smug authority that begged to be knocked down a peg or two. Elias leaned against his tractor, crossing his arms, watching the parade with the bemused interest of a man watching an overacted holodrama. Varkos's gaze swept over the settlement, rows of ramshackle huts and stubbornly defiant colonists. "Citizens," he announced, voice amplified to an unnecessary volume. "By order of the Galactic Empire, this settlement is hereby requisitioned for resources. Compliance is mandatory." Murmurs of fear rippled through the crowd, but Elias simply spat into the dust. "Requisitioned? Huh," he muttered. "Fancy word for stealing." Two soldiers approached Elias, rifles trained casually on his chest. One nudged him with the butt of his weapon. "You got a problem, old man?" Elias looked down at the rifle, then back up at the soldier unimpressed. "Last fella pointed a gun at me, didn't have hands long enough to regret it." The soldier hesitated, unnerved by the twinkle of challenge in the old man's eyes. But Varkos intervened, strolling over with an air of manufactured patience. "You misunderstand, Elder. The Empire doesn't take. It protects. And in return, it asks for contributions." Elias barked a laugh. "Protection? From what? Dry weather and bad crops?" He glanced around, noting the terror in his neighbor's eyes, fear that gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. "We don't need your protection. And we sure as hell don't need you, Takin. What little we got." Varkos' smile thinned, patience evaporating. "Rebellion, even in words, is dangerous. I suggest you reconsider." Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Varkos could hear. "You ever been punched so hard your ancestors felt it?" For a moment, there was silence, a charged, fragile silence that felt like the universe holding its breath. Then Varkos signaled, and the soldiers seized Elias, dragging him to the center of the square. Cries of protest erupted from the crowd, but they were silenced by the ominous hum of charged blasters. "Let this be a lesson," Varkos declared, his voice echoing against the steel and stone, "to those who think defiance is a path to freedom." Elias stood tall, chin lifted, eyes burning with a defiance that hadn't dimmed since his youth. He looked over the crowd, friends, neighbors, people he'd seen grow from children into weary adults under Imperial rule. He saw their fear, their hopelessness, and something inside him refused to bend. Varkos raised his blaster, aiming with a bored detachment. "Any last words, old man?" Elias locked eyes with the commander, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Yeah," he rasped, voice laced with iron. "My son will come for you." Varkos chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "And who might that be? A farmer with a pitchfork?" Elias's grin widened, teeth gleaming against his sun-weathered skin. "Not exactly." The shot rang out, echoing through the settlement, followed by a heavy silence. Elias crumpled to the ground, eyes still open, fixed on the sky as if watching the stars he'd once dreamed of exploring. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the dry earth a stark, unforgiving red. The crowd stood frozen, breaths held in collective mourning. But somewhere in that silence, a seed of rebellion was planted, watered with blood and nourished by a promise of vengeance. Varkos turned on his heel, signaling his men to begin the looting, dismissing the old man's final words as nothing more than empty bravado. But whispers spread, soft, fearful at first, then louder, insistent. Tales of Elias's son, spoken in hushed tones, as if uttering his name might conjure a phantom. They spoke of a ghost in the shadows, a soldier who had faced horrors that would break lesser men. Above, the twin suns dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch hungrily toward the Empire's soldiers. And somewhere, far from this desolate place, aboard a warship that prowled the stars like a silent predator, a message was received. A son learned of his father's fate, and a promise was made. The Empire would learn, all too soon, that some ghosts never rest. The message arrived during a lull in the firefight, slipping through encrypted channels like a whisper from a ghost. Captain Darius Kane barely glanced at the notification on his wristcom before snapping off another clean shot, dropping a snarling Threxian warlord from 200 meters away. The battlefield was a mess of plasma fire and smoke, bodies of reptilian insurgents littering the dirt. But for Darius, it was just another Tuesday. Commanders down. Ghost reported through comms, his voice calm as ever. Think that means they surrender now? Only if they're smart, Darius muttered, scanning the battlefield. Spoiler alert, the Threxians were not smart. The enemy let out a guttural war cry and charged. Darius sighed, shaking his head. Idiots! By the time the dust settled, Spectre Squad was the only thing left standing. The battlefield, once chaotic, had fallen into eerie silence. Darius took a breath, heart still thrumming with adrenaline, then finally glanced at the message. Transmission received. Subject, Elias Kane deceased. Location, Eridani 4. Cause of death, Imperial execution ****. Darius stared at the words, unblinking, as if reading them twice would make them disappear. He was distantly aware of Viper and Reaper exchanging looks, Ghost standing a little too still. Even Shadow, who had once taken a knife to the ribs without flinching, looked uneasy. Darius forced himself to breathe. Breathe, damn it. Boss. Viper's voice was unusually hesitant. Everything all right? Darius exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, a scalpel cutting through the tension. Pack up. We're leaving. Ghost frowned. Orders are to secure the... I don't give a damn about the orders. That shut everyone up. Spectre Squad was feared across the galaxy. An elite unit deployed only when absolute precision and lethality were required. They followed Darius not just because he was the best, but because he never lost control. Until now. Where are we going? Reaper asked. Darius clenched his jaw, staring into the horizon where the twin moons hung low in the sky. Home. Stealing a stealth ship from the Terran military was, objectively speaking, a bad idea. But Darius was already a dead man walking. If not in reality, then certainly in the eyes of anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Spectre Squad didn't hesitate. They hijacked the Black Viper, an advanced infiltration craft, slipped past orbital security, and burned through hyperspace toward Eridani for like a spear thrown by an angry god. Darius sat in the cockpit, fingers tapping an impatient rhythm against his knee. He hadn't spoken much since they left. Viper, never one for silence, finally leaned back in his seat and whistled. So, who exactly did the Empire just piss off? Darius's gaze stayed locked on the stars. My father. Viper blinked. Wait, your dad? As in, the guy who raised you? Reaper, polishing his combat knife, snorted. Man must have been terrifying. He was a farmer, Darius corrected, though his voice was oddly tight. Viper raised an eyebrow. Yeah, and I'm the Queen of Mars. Ghost, who had known Darius the longest, shifted slightly in his seat. What happened? Darius's grip tightened. The Empire happened. That was all he said. But Spectre Squad understood. And if they didn't? Well, They'd see soon enough. Eridani, for was just as he remembered it, dry, stubborn, and quietly dying under the weight of imperial rule. The Black Viper landed just outside the settlement, cloaked beneath the cover of night. Darius stepped onto the soil, inhaling deeply. The air smelled of dust and old memories. His father's house was just ahead, a small, unassuming structure that had somehow withstood the Empire's arrogance. Except his father wasn't inside. His father was never going to be inside again. The thought hit him harder than expected, but he forced it down, turning instead to the gathered colonists. They watched him warily, whispering among themselves. They knew who he was, or at least they thought they did. An old woman, face lined with sorrow, stepped forward. "You're Elias's boy." Darius nodded once. "Where's the body?" There was a beat of silence. Then she motioned for him to follow. They took him to a simple grave, freshly dug. No marker, no elaborate ceremony, just dirt and quiet grief. Darius knelt, brushing his fingers over the earth. His father had been many things: a stubborn bastard, a war veteran, a man who believed in doing the right thing even when it got him killed. His father had also been a warning. "My son will come for you." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Darius stood, turning to the woman. "Who did it?" "Imperial Commander. Varkos," she said. "Shot him in front of everyone. Didn't even flinch." A muscle ticked in Darius's jaw. "Where is he now?" "In the garrison at the center of town," she said, lowering her voice. "Him and 200 men." Viper let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a lot of bodies between us and him." Darius's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then we'd better get started." The colonists looked between them, half in awe, half in fear. It wasn't every day that the deadliest special forces unit in human history walked into your backyard, promising blood. The old woman studied Darius's face carefully. "What are you planning, boy?" Darius met her gaze, voice quiet but carrying the weight of inevitability. "I'm going to kill them all." In the Imperial garrison, Commander Varkos sat comfortably in his quarters, sipping a glass of Terran whiskey. The execution had been messy, sure, but necessary. These backwater colonies needed a firm hand. His officers were still uneasy. There had been whispers, nervous chatter about the old man's son. A soldier had even mentioned the word specter, but Varkos had laughed it off. "Just myths," he told them. "Legends." There was no ghost coming for them. No nightmare lurking in the dark. No soldier ruthless enough to take on an entire garrison. But outside, in the shadows of the settlement, Spectre Squad was already moving. And by the time Varkos realized his mistake, it would be far too late. The night was thick with silence, the kind that carried weight, pressing against the air like a storm waiting to break. Spectre Squad moved through the shadows like they belonged there, because they did. Eridani IV's Imperial garrison loomed ahead, a steel monolith against the dusty plains, wrapped in the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. Darius Kane intended to correct that assumption. From their vantage point atop an old grain silo, he studied the garrison's layout through his visor. Guard rotations, security points, weaknesses. It was a standard Imperial fortress, efficient, brutal, and deeply overconfident. 200 men inside. 200 men who would not see the sunrise. Viper crouched beside him. Chewing on a protein ration like this was just another mission. "So, boss, we going quiet or loud?" Darius didn't look away from the fortress. "Quiet. Until it isn't." Viper grinned. "My favorite kind." Reaper clicked his knife open and shut in anticipation. "Stealth insertion, target elimination, full wipe?" Darius nodded. "No alarms. No survivors." Ghost, ever the pragmatist, glanced at the garrison walls. "We'll need a distraction to thin their numbers. Hit a weak point, make them think it's an accident. That'll buy us time to move inside." Darius smirked. "Then let's make the Empire trip over its own boots." A minute later, Shadow was gone, silent as a whisper, slipping into the dark like she had never existed. They didn't have to wait long. The first explosion was small, targeted, an auxiliary power line near the eastern wall, sending a cascade of sparks into the night. From the garrison, shouts erupted. Spotlights flared to life, sweeping the perimeter, searching for an attacker that wasn't there. A squad of soldiers mobilized, moving toward the disturbance with military efficiency. 15 men down already, Reaper murmured. How generous of them. Darius watched them go, their absence peeling away a layer of defense. The garrison was still alert, but now they were reacting, which meant they weren't thinking ahead. Big mistake. Move, he ordered. Spectre squad advanced, weaving through the dark. The first sentries never saw them coming. Ghost snapped a soldier's neck before he could gasp, lowering him soundlessly into the dirt. Reaper's knife slipped between ribs with surgical precision. A breath exhaled, a body left cooling in the night air. Viper, never one for subtlety, caught a guard under the chin, holding him long enough for the life to leave his eyes before easing him down. Darius handled his own targets. Fast, efficient, permanent. Within minutes, they had breached the outer defenses, slinking through the corridors like death incarnate. Inside, the garrison hummed with muted activity. Officers at terminals, troopers in barracks, engineers unaware their lives were ticking toward an abrupt halt. Viper peeked around a corner. So, do we have a plan for what happens when this gets messy? Darius adjusted the strap on his rifle. Yes. Viper waited. And Darius checked his weapon. It gets messy. Reaper chuckled. I love this job. They moved deeper. Each step deliberate, every breath measured. Spectre Squad had infiltrated high-security prisons, corporate strongholds, even warships drifting in deep space. Compared to those, an Imperial garrison was a soft target wrapped in steel. But Darius wasn't here for sport. He was here for one man, Commander Varkos. The bastard had executed his father, treating it like nothing more than a footnote in the Empire's endless expansion. Darius could still hear the old man's voice, rough with age but steady as ever. My son will come for you. Varkos had laughed. Darius wondered if he'd still be laughing when he realized the ghost in the dark wasn't a myth. A door hissed open down the hall. Two officers emerged, chatting idly, unaware of the death stalking their steps. Worried about the colony. Rumors say someone's coming. The other scoffed. Even if they did, this is an Imperial garrison. No one gets in or out without clearance. Darius slipped behind them, silent as breath. They say it's the old man's kid, the first officer continued, uneasy. That he's some kind of... Darius slit his throat before he could finish. The second officer had half a second to react before Ghost caught him from behind, a precise blade slipping through flesh. They collapsed together, blood pooling beneath them, their warning dying with them. Viper whistled. So much for rumors. Darius stepped over the bodies, wiping his blade clean. Keep moving. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No alarms yet. No panic. Just men in uniforms, oblivious to the Reapers in their midst. Until they reach his office. Commander Varkos's quarters were sealed, guarded by two elite troopers standing rigid at the entrance. Unlike the others, these men were prepared. Armor reinforced, weapons primed. Darius looked at Reaper. Reaper grinned. The troopers barely had time to register the movement before Reaper's knives found their mark, slipping beneath helmets, carving through flesh. They sagged to the floor, dead before they hit the ground. Darius stepped over the bodies and keyed the door controls. The lock disengaged with a soft chime. Inside, Varkos was reclining at his desk, oblivious, nursing a glass of whiskey and reviewing reports like he hadn't just ordered the execution of an innocent man days prior. Darius walked in, slow, deliberate. Varkos glanced up, frowning. And then he saw the blood on Darius's gloves. The weapons. The look in his eyes. The color drained from the commander's face. Hello, Commander, Darius said, voice cold as death. Varkos scrambled for his sidearm. Darius shot him in the knee. The commander howled, dropping his weapon, clutching his shattered leg. You. You. Darius kicked the gun across the room, crouching down until they were at eye level. You killed my father, he said, voice calm. Now I'm going to return the favor. Varkos's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. You can't. Do you have any idea who I am? Darius pressed his blade against the man's throat. You're dead. he said simply. Outside, the garrison still stood, unaware that their commander had just become a ghost. But soon, the silence would end, and the hunt would truly begin. Commander Varkos had always believed in the Empire's invincibility. It was a comforting lie, one he had wrapped himself in like a warm blanket. The Empire was power, control, order. The Empire did not fear ghosts. And yet, as he bled onto the cold floor of his office, staring into the eyes of the man who had torn through his garrison like a specter of vengeance, he understood something terrible. The Empire was afraid. Darius Kane had made sure of that. Varkos gasped, pain lacing his breath. You can't do this, he wheezed. Killing me won't change anything. Darius tilted his head, considering that. That's true, he admitted. Then he leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. But it'll feel really damn good. And then he slit Varkos's throat. The commander gurgled, hands clawing at his own neck, eyes bulging in disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process that he, an officer of the mighty Galactic Empire, was dying on the floor of his own fortress, helpless as a slaughtered pig. Darius wiped his blade clean and stood. Behind him, Viper let out a low whistle. Well, that was satisfying. Ghost, ever the professional, checked his chrono. We've got maybe 5 minutes before someone notices the commander's absence. Reaper stepped over the body, already rifling through the desk. So, do we torch this place on the way out, or? A klaxon blared. Reaper sighed. And there it is. Darius didn't flinch. Tomago loud. Viper grinned. Now this is my favorite kind. The garrison erupted into chaos as the alarm spread. Soldiers scrambled from barracks, shouting commands, weapons drawn. Darius led Spectre Squad into the hallway, moving with lethal precision. The first wave of troopers barely had time to aim before Ghost dropped them with pinpoint shots, his rifle whisper quiet, each round a surgical strike. Reaper, a blur of knives and close-quarters brutality, cut through a squad before their screams could even reach the next corridor. Viper? Viper was having fun. He vaulted over a barricade, unloading his rifle into 3 stunned officers before grabbing a discarded grenade and tossing it over his shoulder. It exploded somewhere behind him with a satisfying boom. Oops, he said, not sounding the least bit sorry. Darius, leading the charge, fired without hesitation, dropping targets one after another. They had trained for war, for impossible odds, for the kind of brutal efficiency that made their enemies whisper their name in fear. But this wasn't war. This was extermination. A squad of troopers tried to form a defensive line near the armory. Darius barely gave them time to set their feet before he lobbed a stunned charge into their midst. The blast sent them sprawling, weapons clattering. Spectre Squad moved in, finishing them before they could recover. Status? Darius asked, reloading. Ghost barely glanced at his tactical readout. 86 hostiles remaining. 17 eliminated in the last 2 minutes. Viper grinned, reloading with a flourish. Let's see if we can break our record. The Empire was panicking now. Officers barked desperate orders. Soldiers scrambled for cover. But it was like watching prey trapped in a burning cage. They weren't fighting an enemy. They were being hunted. A sergeant tried to rally a counterattack, shouting into his comms. We have intruders in the main. Darius shot him in the throat. Another officer ducked behind a console, calling for reinforcements. He never saw a shadow slip up behind him, a blade gliding between his ribs. Outside, armored transports revved up, ready to deploy reinforcements. Ghost tapped his wrist comm. Shadow, you're up. A second later, the air cracked with controlled explosions. The transport bay erupted in fire and metal, shrapnel raining down as the vehicles were reduced to flaming wreckage. Viper let out a low whistle. You know, I'm starting to think the Empire really should have just left your dad alone. Darius's jaw tightened. They're learning that now. The final wave of resistance came in the form of a last-ditch barricade, soldiers clustering near the central corridor, rifles raised. Darius stopped just short of the kill zone, studying them. Their hands were shaking. He could see it in their eyes, the fear. Good. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, lowering his rifle. The soldiers hesitated. Lay down your weapons, Darius said, voice even. Walk away. A lieutenant young, desperate, swallowed hard. You'll just kill us anyway. Darius tilted his head. If that were true, you'd already be dead. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. The Empire had told them that Spectre Squad was a myth. That Darius Kane was a ghost, a story whispered in barracks to keep recruits in line. And yet, here he was, real, bleeding, unstoppable. One by one, the rifles clattered to the ground. Darius nodded once. Smart choice. Ghost moved in, securing the surrendering soldiers while Viper sighed, clearly disappointed. I was kind of hoping they'd put up more of a fight. Reaper clapped him on the shoulder. Cheer up, there's always the next garrison. Darius turned, taking one last look at the bloodstained corridors, the bodies, the wreckage. The Empire thought it was untouchable, that it could execute his father and move on like nothing had happened. But they had made a mistake. They had started a war, and now they were about to learn Spectre Squad never stopped hunting The smoke still curled lazily from the wreckage as Darius Kane stood atop the ruined Imperial garrison, his breath steady despite the carnage below. The night air carried the acrid scent of scorched metal and blood, but to him, it smelled like justice. Not peace, because peace had died with his father, but justice. Spectre Squad stood beside him, watching as the fires consumed the remains of the outpost. They had done what they came for. Varkos was dead. His executioners were dead. The men who stood by and did nothing were dead. Viper exhaled, stretching his arms. Well, that was cathartic. Reaper wiped his blade on a fallen officer's uniform, shaking his head. I don't know. I was expecting a little more groveling from the commander. Really disappointing. Ghost checked his rifle, his voice as unreadable as ever. They'll know it was us. They'll come. Darius nodded. Of course they would. The Empire had endured wars, rebellions, insurrections. It had crushed planets, silenced entire civilizations. It would not ignore this. It couldn't ignore this. Viper smirked. Let him. Darius allowed himself a small, humorless smile. Oh, they would come, and they would regret it, The squad slipped into the night, moving like shadows through the ruins of the garrison. Extraction was waiting a few clicks south, a stolen transport hidden in the cliffs. But before they reached it, a voice crackled through Darius's calm. Spectre Actual, we have a problem. It was Shadow. She rarely sounded worried. Darius tapped his earpiece. Go. Orbital scans show incoming Imperial ships. Not a patrol. A full battle group. Viper let out a low whistle. Guess they took this personally. Ghost frowned. They moved fast. Too fast. Darius's stomach tightened. They weren't just responding to the garrison. They had known, which meant someone had talked. Reaper cursed. We have a leak. Darius didn't answer. His mind was already moving, dissecting possibilities. They had worked clean. No witnesses. No survivors. The only ones left were the men who had surrendered. Had one of them warned the Empire? Or had the Empire known before they struck? It didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was survival. Darius switched channels. Shadow, what's our window? Less than 15 minutes before they hit orbit. 10 before they start bombing anything that moves. Viper groaned. See, this is why I say we need an exit plan that isn't just run really fast. Reaper shrugged. Hey, it's worked so far. Ghost ignored them. If we push hard, we can make the transport in 8. Darius nodded. Move. They ran. Through the ruins, across the shattered plains, over the bones of an empire that thought itself invincible. The wind howled, carrying the distant roar of approaching ships, the low whine of engines readying for destruction. Their stolen transport was still where they had left it, camouflaged against the rocky cliffs. Darius climbed into the cockpit, flicking switches, powering up engines. Shadow's voice cut through the comms. I've got 6 destroyers locking onto ground positions. They're not waiting for survivors. Viper flopped into a seat. Wow, they're really mad. Reaper smirked. Feels good, doesn't it? The transport lurched as Darius gunned the thrusters, lifting off just as the first bolts of green energy slammed into the ground behind them. The garrison, what remained of it, vanished in a column of fire and debris. They punched through the atmosphere, rattling hard as the sensors screamed warnings. Imperial fighters were already inbound. Ghost checked the scanners. 5 on intercept course. Viper cracked his knuckles. All right, who wants to bet I can take him out with nothing but the rear turret and bad intentions? Darius didn't have time for bets. He yanked the controls, weaving through the chaos as the fighters closed in. Shadow's voice returned. Exit vector calculated. You got one shot at this. Darius didn't hesitate. He pushed the engines to their limit, the ship groaning under the strain. The fighters swarmed, lasers lighting up the black, but Spectre Squad didn't stop. Didn't slow. The Empire had come, but they were already gone. The moment they hit the jump, the silence was almost deafening. The tension in the cockpit eased, the weight of battle peeling away. Viper stretched, yawning. Well, that was fun. Ghost ignored him. We need a new safe house. The Empire's going to be hunting us across half the sector. Darius exhaled, his grip finally loosening on the controls. We'll find one. Reaper grinned. And then Darius looked out at the stars. The Empire would never stop. They wouldn't forget. They wouldn't forgive. But neither would he. His father's death had been the beginning. Varkos had been the first, but not the last. Darius Kane was coming for them. All of them. And the Empire's worst nightmare had only just begun.